a Canadian radio sanctuary podcast. Our guest is Camille Correa of the Great Blue Heron Nature Reserve Society, the executive director.
That's correct.
Tell us a bit of the background of this reserve.
Well, the background is fairly interesting. In 1942, the Canadian government established a military training base at the Vetter Crossing called Camp Chilliwack. And one of the factions of that base was what's called a wet gap or a wet bridge training area. And that is what is now the Great Blue Heron Nature Reserve. So the lagoon that is a dominant feature of the reserve was actually excavated by the military in the early 50s as part of their wet bridge training program. So when they decided to decommission the wet bridge training area in the late 90s, so in 1998 it was, the CFB Chilliwack proposed that maybe it would be a good idea to have a nature reserve here. And the Chilliwack Rotary Club formed a committee to coordinate what they called their Millennium Project. So it was in February of 1999 that the idea for the interpretive center that we're sitting in now came to be, and the Rotary Plan was approved by the City Council around that time. John Milne's graphic designs were incorporated, so if you see our logo and all of that, that was all conceived by John Milne. There were a lot of hoops that needed to be jumped through in order to find the exact right site. There was a lot of worry about flooding and those kinds of things, so it took a couple of years to find the right place for the interpretive center. But the building was finally completed in February of 2002 and formally gifted to the people of Chilliwack in March of 2002. So now the Great Blue Heron Nature Reserve Society exists to manage the lands that are here. It's a not-for-profit that manages the programs and services that are given here at the Great Blue Heron Nature Reserve. So the Great Blue Heron Nature Reserve comprises about 325 acres of undiked floodplain, which is very rare in this part of the Fraser Valley where water is controlled by humans to protect farming land and residential areas. Everyone is probably aware of the dike that is quite long and runs between Abbotsford and Chilliwack and controls a lot of the flow of water. So having undiked floodplain is very rare, and it's a special kind of habitat for a lot of different animals. So the mandate of the Great Blue Heron Nature Reserve Society it includes protection of this undiked wetland ecosystem of the Great Blue Heron Nature Reserve, but it also includes education and enjoyment for the public. So we're constantly trying to balance those two mandates. I think a lot of people are under the impression that the Great Blue Heron Nature Reserve is a public park, which it's not. The difference between a public park and a nature reserve is that a nature reserve is a protected area of importance for wildlife and flora and fauna, perhaps other natural features. So it's specifically here for the conservation of the habitat that is here and the animals and plants that enjoy that type of habitat, whereas a public park is more conceived specifically for the enjoyment of people. So Sardis Park is a good example of a public park in our area. And it's still, it's very much open to the public. We had 26,000 people come through the interpretive center in the last year. And that means, that those are people who've come into the center and been counted by our volunteers. That's not just people who are enjoying our trails. And of course, that includes probably a number of repeat visitors. There's a lot of people in the community who enjoy coming to the reserve on a regular basis. The land is owned by the city. So we have a management agreement with the city. The city does a lot of maintenance. They help with the maintenance of the trails and the maintenance of the buildings and pay our phone bill, those kinds of things. And we have caretakers who live on site and are employed by the city to help in the maintenance of the land. But the job of the Great Blue Heron Nature Reserve Society is to manage the use of the lands and to come up with different ideas for management and education in protecting this unique ecological habitat. So there's a lot of different kinds of animals, provincially significant animals, species at risk that make their homes at the Great Blue Heron Nature Reserve. Probably the most notable being the Great Blue Heron itself, which is, I think a lot of people are surprised to find that the Great Blue Heron is actually considered to be a species at risk. And the reason why is because they're colonial nesters. They all come together in one place when they're nesting. And if that nesting area gets damaged or invaded too much by human presence, then that can change the reproductive cycle quite drastically, because we have about 140 nests in our colony. It's been here for over 50 years. It's a very stable colony, and it's withstood having military activity and all of that. So the likelihood of these herons abandoning their nesting area is not high, but we still have to be very careful about what kinds of impacts we have on them. A huge part of what we do here is education, and that includes the volunteers educating anybody who comes into the interpretive center and telling them about what we have here, what the trail systems are like, what kinds of animals live here, that kind of thing. And we have all kinds of different volunteers. We're a not-for-profit, so we don't actually have many employees at all. I'm one of the only employees, and I only work 25 hours a week. And then we have a couple of educators that come in on a casual basis whenever we have a program booked for them. But for the most part, we count on our volunteers. We have 60 plus volunteers who do the gardening and run, just keep the interpretive center open in general, because we have a reception area and we have a small gift shop and those kinds of things. So we count on the volunteers to do all of that. And when a new volunteer comes in, they're trained by one of the older volunteers, and they are hopefully knowledgeable on what exactly the Great Blue Heron Nature Reserve is and how to share that with the public coming in. As I said earlier, a lot of the people that come here are going to be just visitors from the community, both from Abbotsford and Chilliwack, since we're kind of right in between. But we have people that come from Siberia and people who come from New Zealand. It's always really amazing to see where some of the tourists are from. We are definitely a tourist destination. One of the really main things that we do outside of that is our school programs. We're a pretty popular destination for schools to book field trips at. We have a lot of different programs that we've customized for school children, mostly primary school, but we do university programs. We do pretty much anything we can customize for any kind of group. And there's a lot of community groups that will come to. We have seniors groups that will book tours, and for a minimal donation of $75, you can have an hour tour for quite a few people. We've even had, just people who want to book a tour for themselves and their friends, and then we have knowledgeable interpreters who are able to do those kinds of tours. But yeah, that's probably one of the main things we do. I would like, in the future, hopefully, and it's very hard as a not-for-profit, of course. I mean, we do get some funding from the city, very basic funding. I think my wage is paid by the city. But outside of that, we count on grants and donations, and that's a huge part of my job is writing grants and bringing money in that way. Donations, memberships, fundraising, those kinds of things. But I would love to at some point have a budget so that we could have an interpreter on site more regularly, so that people wouldn't necessarily have to pay for a tour, but we would have interpreters who would be able to regularly take people on walks and I think really sort of stress that that difference between us being a reserve and a park, because that's a really important part of who we are, what the reserve is, because this is a really special habitat for the Fraser Valley. Because of its uniqueness, there has to be a focus on the protection and conservation and limiting the impacts of the multitudes of people who are enjoying using this area as well.
It's a beautiful setting here, and if people want to learn more about the reserve and hours of operation and so on, is there a website they can go to?
There certainly is. If you look up the Great Blue Heron Nature Reserve, you will find our website on Google. It's easy to find.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Camille.
You're more than welcome. Thank you.